Welcome to our first lesson on the Renaissance. So, in this unit, we're going to basically be getting into just how Western civilization just kind of comes out of medieval times. So, up to this point, we've had two other units. We've had the unit on medieval times, and we also did a unit on the Age of Exploration. One of the main reasons why we did the medieval times just before this one is once you have that understanding of what society was like under feudalism and things like that, and just what life was like then, you understand the transition we get in what is called the Renaissance, which means rebirth, by the way, which I'll be bringing up on the next slide. Next up, we did the Age of Exploration, which actually happens in tandem with the Renaissance, meaning they happen at the exact same time. It's not the idea of like it comes before and then the Renaissance happens. In fact, really the Renaissance happens in many ways before the Age of Exploration. Well, it actually happens before the Age of Exploration does, and the Age of Exploration is one of the consequences of the Renaissance, you could say. And I'll explain more about that as we move on, but just make sure you have that in mind, that a lot of things we're going to be talking about we did medieval times as kind of like a pre-unit to lead into this, because modern world history, which this class is, starts really with this. Modern Western world history starts a lot with this, and a lot of just what modern world history is starts with this, meaning the Renaissance, leading in, going on to other units we'll get into, especially the Enlightenment, because many areas of the world today are affected by that type of thinking, where Western civilization has permeated a lot of the rest of the world. Anyways, so to understand the world today, even from places like China or India, you need to understand a lot of the ideas that come out of Europe in the Renaissance and later on the Enlightenment. Again, the Enlightenment being a unit we'll get to in the future. So, it doesn't mean it's completely reformed everywhere, but it's hard to understand the events of the present and over especially the last few hundred years without understanding the transformation of Europe and how that spreads out to the rest of the world. And that's one of the reasons why I did the Age of Exploration already, is because, well, that was Europe spreading out to the rest of the world, and they bring this thinking with them to the rest of the world. So the stuff we're going to be talking about from here on out for about the next 2 to 3 units or so, starting with this one, the Renaissance, including also things like the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution. This stuff spreads out because the Europeans are spreading out. Anyways, that being said, what specifically is the Renaissance? The Renaissance is a term that, well, in a lot of the Romance languages refers to the rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman thinking, art, learning, and that type of stuff. Let's put it this way. The Europeans have had Roman and Greek stuff around them for forever. Just like put some pictures up there, some busted up statues. I believe those are Roman statues. And the artwork is quite good. They make them fairly lifelike. And during medieval times, they would see this stuff, and it was just like a relic of an old age, kind of move beyond that. I shouldn't say really move beyond that, but like I said, we call those the Dark Ages for a reason. The Renaissance is when they're starting to come out of that, just that idea of like, oh, everything's about farming and fighting. It's just have a crappy life, do the best I can, hopefully I go to heaven. Just that medieval thinking that we talked about earlier, into more of just like, wait a second, things can be a little bit different. Maybe my life doesn't have to be so crappy. Now, this isn't where just everybody has this type of thinking. This process of feeling like I can have a better life, or maybe my life has more meaning, honestly, is still going on today. But it's a process that goes on basically from like the late 1300s through the how do I put this? Late 1300s, 1400s, through about the 1600s, you could say, really just, again, to today, but the transformative process is mostly 1400s to 1600s. Anyways, talk about that as we move on. So, just to bring up a few other things that we've talked about already, when it comes to why this is such a rebirth, is, yes, they see all this stuff around them, meaning that the people like in the 1400s see all this Roman and Greek stuff around them, buildings, statues, different artwork and whatnot, but they can't recreate it. And then all of a sudden they just think, well, why not? Why not recreate it? And of course the question comes in at that point is like, well, why didn't they do that in the first place? Well, just they didn't have the time, and more importantly, the education and the wealth, and then the education to do so. And I'll explain that process here. Now, it's not just the art, but also the thinking. Actually, that's probably the more important part, is the thinking. We usually think of, like, those of you that might be familiar with the Renaissance, we usually think of it as like Renaissance art. It's a bunch of paintings, and everybody seems to be a bit naked. Well, that's the visual part of it. The Renaissance more is a thought process. Again, a transition from medieval way of thinking into the more modern way of thinking that we have today, especially in Western civilization. And that's why I have the picture down at the bottom. That's Archimedes there, science essentially, and just trying to figure out the world. We have this beginning of figuring out the world that turns into, like you could say, starts with the Renaissance and turns into later what is called the scientific revolution, which is going to be the last portion of this overall unit we're going to be getting into. I'll have a lesson on that later. Let's talk about right now why the Renaissance is able to come about in the late 1300s to 1400s. It just comes down to really the trade that we talked about from Age of Exploration. Like in the last unit, the last unit we talked about the Age of Exploration. If you remember this, it began because of this desire that people wanted to get trade routes to the east so they could just have a better quality of life. In the end, they just wanted better quality of life. There's a lot of other little things that go into that, like, hey, I'd like to have, it's got a lot of ambition and things like that in there, curiosity and stuff like that mixed in, but it just comes down to this idea that, man, you just want a better quality of life. One of the reasons why Europeans, say in like Spain or France or England, saw this higher quality of life is because the one area that did get a very good quality of life, you could say upgrade, in the 1300s, just after the Crusades, or during and after the Crusades, were the Italian city-states. They were just geographically located to be in a good spot to where all that trade coming from the Middle East would basically filter through them. And so you start to get some very small but wealthy and powerful city-states in northern Italy, namely places like cities in northern Italy, and they just have massive amounts of wealth coming in because of the trade across the Silk Roads. Of course, the number one thing being sugar that we talked about in the last unit. So with all this massive wealth coming in, well, one of the things we see throughout all of world history, and including today, is when you start getting a lot more wealth, then all of a sudden you can start affording a better education, or even having the time to want to be educated. All of a sudden when you have someone who is just really wealthy, say in northern Italy, let's say in Venice, and they have tons of statues around from the ancient Romans, from 1,500 years before, 1,000 years before, they're like, you know what? I would really like one of those statues. Does anybody know how to make one of those statues for me? I want a statue like that for me. I'm egotistical, whatever. I want a statue like that for myself. And I'm really wealthy. I should be able to get it. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, no one knows how to do that. Well, why not? Can someone learn, please? You could have someone say, well, I would love to learn, but I'm too busy farming and trying to feed my family. I was like, well, tell you what. You learn how to do that. You spend as much time as you can. I will pay you a salary as you learn how to basically make statues and make artwork and things like that. And then I want you to make a statue just like that for me. And so all of a sudden you get these very wealthy patrons that are able to pay for people to essentially become more educated, to kind of delve into, like, how do I make statues? How do we figure out how to make better technologies and things like that? How do we increase our abilities and comforts in life? And just that's how it just all begins. But it does start with just having the wealth to do so, and the desire, the curiosity to do so. And the curiosity was basically already there because they already had so much stuff around them, just visuals, the buildings and the artwork of the ancient Romans and Greeks. Like, what is that? What's going on? They've had records from people like Aristotle that I talked about way back in last semester, where, a lot of people could read at that point, but now it becomes more like, well, let's maybe apply this a little bit more, of the ideas of the ancient Greeks and Romans, even though, well, we'll get to it a little bit later, but, the church kind of gets a little bit like, there's a reason why we got rid of this stuff, because we don't think it leads to Christ, and anyways, Does that cause some problems between, you could say, like early Renaissance artists and thinkers versus like the kind of the more church traditionalists? Yes, it does. Galileo is probably the biggest character there. We'll get to him when we talk about the scientific revolution. So, but if you're noticing, I'm leading into what it says down there at the bottom, where it says, with all this added knowledge and intelligence comes this idea of questioning the power of the church. Now, I need to throw one more thing in there, and that is the Black Death. We talked about this during medieval times, but it bears repeating at this point. With all this massive wealth coming in because of trade, and then you have the Black Death that hit basically at the same time in the 1300s, it's almost like these people are primed, the people who survived this, are primed with this idea of like, wait a minute, this freedom I had with no one here around me telling me what to do because everybody's dead, although heck, probably your family's dead too a bit, but no one's there to tell you what to do. Wow, that's freedom. And it's like, wait a minute, I would like to learn how to read the Bible for myself. The church, they were saying things like everybody dying are sinners and things like that, but then the church officials are dying too. Well, I was listening to that guy my whole life, and I was trusting that he was telling me everything, but I would like to figure out for myself what is true. So I'd like to learn how to read the Bible. Even if the church tells me not to, I still feel like that's a good thing for me to do. People, like this opens up all these questions and questioning the world around you, essentially because of this wealth and wealth that leads into education, and then the setup you get after the Black Death. And of course you get things like the Crusades we talked about in the medieval years as well, where you just, the curiosity is like, wow, how do they get such good lives over there? Wow, that food is amazing. What they're dressed in is amazing. Like, how do we get that too? So all that is just combining into just setting up the stage for what is the European Renaissance that starts in northern Italy. So, and it does spread across Europe over time, but it does start in Italy. Now, I prefaced everything that's going to be right here. I kind of prefaced as we were talking about that last slide a bit. But once you have these people that are just like, man, it's nice to kind of think for yourself, learn for yourself, be in control of your life, have that freedom, you could say. Well, this starts off a movement called Humanism. Humanism is this idea that the human mind and the human body, basically you as a human being are worth it. I don't know how else to put that as simply as possible. You are worth it. God actually likes you as you type thing. And I do mean this idea of God likes you. That's the thought process at the time. There really wasn't anybody believing that there weren't any God. There was no God at this point. I'll talk about that in just a second, though, and just how that changes over time. But people are like, in medieval times, the medieval way of thinking was like, man, life sucks. I'm born as a serf. I can't get ahead in life because I'm not supposed to. I just got to take it, and hopefully if I do the best job I can get to heaven. I'll just deal with things then. But with humanism, you get this idea, it's like, wait a minute. You have this idea, like, I believe that God created me. I think that even on, yes, life is hard, I think he actually wants me to have a good life, that I actually should do things like that. I should basically get through my trials, you could say. It's not all about just having a crappy life. You can work through that to have a good life. I should exercise my mind. I should exercise my body to have that better life. To kind of climb up the ladder, however you want to put that, and just achieve those goals and those things that I feel like are achievable. And the higher your mind reaches, the more the idea of like, yes, I want to get there, and I think God wants me to get there too. Like this, especially this idea of just looking at the human body as the sole focus of it, that your mind can get smarter, that you can achieve more with it, you can do more with it, you can provide for your family better with it. Same thing with your body, just all of that is there. And this is one of the reasons why you get a lot of naked statues and naked paintings from the Renaissance. It's not that they're like a bunch of perverts, although with some of them you look at, you kind of wonder, but I'm not going to go down that road right now. But the one I've included here is actually the epitome of everything we're talking about. This is a guy, kind of like that perfect human being, definitely a well-sculpted body, but he's sitting there thinking. And the whole idea is like, what is he thinking about? Well, could be thinking about anything. Well, to us, that's like, well, I can think about anything because I'm used to it. That's because you live in a world that allows you to do that, you could say, that encourages that. Whereas in the Renaissance, they're living in a world, in Renaissance Europe, 13, 1400s, living in a world where you're not really encouraged to think for yourself. And so when you have a statue like this showing some guy just thinking for the heck of thinking, that is revolutionary. The idea that he could be thinking about anything at all. Whatever you think he may be thinking about is probably right. And at the same time, he's just this perfectly sculpted human being, that this is what humanism is all about. Anyways, the individual holds moral worth, as I say down there. And this whole focus, and I hope I've been explaining this well enough, because I'm trying to explain this way because I'm assuming that anybody here watching this, the students that are watching this right now, you're like, well, that's my whole life is like that, individual worth, except for when my parents keep me down or whatever. But you just have a lot of choices in life. That wasn't the way things were for a long time because society was beating down on you from the feudalistic structure of medieval times. But now we live in a world that benefits from what is called individualism, this focus on the individual, that you should have the opportunity to better yourself and better those around you if you so wish. You hold moral worth. I just can't repeat that more enough times. And this becomes the core basis of Westernization from this Renaissance type of thinking. That is humanism and individualism. Okay, again, I hope that's making sense. I know I'm sounding a bit redundant, but this is a big deal. And I feel like there's one more thing I was needing to talk about here, and it's just flitting from me at the moment. Oh, that's right. Move on to the next one here. So if you're understanding this idea that this individualism is there, that you can do so. Oh, I just remembered what I need to talk about. I said I was going to talk about it in a second. So one thing to very much focus in on is when we're talking about the 13, 14, 1500s, 1600s, even into the 1700s, when someone considers themselves a humanist, this person is like just, seeing what God gave you type thing. Well, I mean to say that. Everybody did believe in God. It's this focus on that God wants you to have a good life. But people that call themselves humanists today, and I'm not really sure when this transition happened, and if you say you're a humanist today, usually, not always, but usually it's saying that you're an atheist. It's because it's the focus on the human body and the progress of humanity itself, because there is no God really guiding you, and we have to focus in on ourselves type thing. That's kind of what it's turned into this day, 500 years later. Again, I wouldn't say that's everybody that calls himself a humanist is an atheist, but those two terms have become synonymous at this point. But I just want to focus one more time for the rest of this unit as we're talking about these lessons, and for most of this class as we're going into other units. Usually when we run into people that are considered humanists, they do have a big belief in God. They just question institutions like, say, the church, in the idea of like, well, are you interpreting the Bible right? I would like to have a say myself in that one. I'd like to see what God has for me, not just what you tell me what God has for me. So that being said, that's what I wanted to get to. So this last thing I'm going to get into also plays off of what we're just talked about a little bit, is you get a new word, you could say, a word called secular. I'm not going to try to explain this really in depth, but I will say that with what is called secularism, it's just the simple idea that you have things that are of God and things that are of the world. And in medieval times, those were pretty much combined because the church was over everything. Now we have this idea of just that, okay, these things is the way God thinks and how I want to run my life, and I can choose to do so. But when we talk about other things like here, like I'm going to the grocery market, well, that's not really something that God is involved in or whatever. Just, again, as is defined down there, the separation between religious doctrine and the governments of men, just how you run your life. The church isn't so much in there. And this secular way of thinking, starts coming in and is definitely viewed as pernicious. Not welcome, better way to put that, especially in like the 13, 14, 1500s, but has slowly become more of the norm today in Western civilization. When I say Western civilization, we're talking about basically Europe, the Americas, and others that basically go along with this, Western thought processes. So the world that you and I live in today is incredibly secular. You could say that religion is really taking a back seat now, especially over these last, probably say about 100 years, and most definitely the last 20 years versus, say, 500 years ago. Anyways, with that, this lesson's already going a bit long. I was planning on getting some other things in a second, but I'll save that for the next lesson, and I will see you guys later.